The Baltic Sea at the end of summer lay flat like a colossal sheet of glass, its deep blue surface barely rippling under the passing breeze that carried with it the mingled scent of salt, oil, and damp air. At the edge of Copenhagen's harbor, beneath pale yellow lamps and the still silhouettes of cranes standing like gigantic skeletons, a long, dark shadow floated uneasily on the water. It didn't look like a tourist boat or a cargo vessel, but more like a stray creature made of metal, its rough black paint reflecting the fading glow of the sunset. Somewhere in the wind came the faint sound of metal clicking something, locking shut, then swallowed by silence, as if a heavy door had just been closed and the echo drowned instantly by the sea. Thin, oily sheens drifted toward the quay, warm and pungent with a metallic chill. From a distance, a bicycle passed by, its tires crunching softly over the damp planks before disappearing behind a row of containers. The pulse of the city seemed to stop at the edge of the light. Beyond it, darkness slowly crept over the water, and in that fragile threshold, the homemade submarine UC3 Nautilus lay still like a question mark forged in steel. Not everyone would have the chance to see such a thing in their lifetime, and even fewer would have the curiosity or courage to step inside it as night began to fall. A petite woman with deep auburn hair stood at the edge of the pier, a small backpack on her shoulders, a notebook and camera tucked beneath her arm. She looked up at the hulk of steel, resting motionless on the surface. It didn't seem large from the outside, yet it carried the cold aura of something built to defy space itself. A gust of wind brushed past, lifting the hem of her jacket and sharpening the scent of rust. She adjusted her strap, glanced at her phone out of habit, then drew a slow breath. In that moment, on the other side of some unseen screen, you might imagine yourself standing there too, feeling the damp wood beneath your feet, hearing the soft lap of water against metal, watching the ripples drift away and noticing something slightly off, barely perceptible, like a clock hand half a beat behind. A metal door opened and shut too quickly. A man stepped up with movements unnervingly precise, his eyes sweeping across everything as if he already knew every bolt and joint of this creation by heart. Such fragments were not yet enough to raise suspicion, but enough to etch a hairline crack into the calm, enough to make you hold your breath and watch the fading daylight a moment longer. What time is it where you are listening to this story? Outside your window, does the sky still hold the last traces of light, or has night completely fallen? Do you feel safe? Have you ever thought that the passion driving your work could one day pull you into a spiral of danger? Be careful, because sometimes evil hides behind the mask of genius. Copenhagen at this hour was quiet. Only a distant horn echoed through the dusk. A few joggers passed along the edge of the park, and the city lights flickered on one by one like grains of salt scattered across the sinking Sunday. From the deck of the submarine, the man waved his smile measured, precise, neither too much nor too little. His face was tanned, his cheekbones sharp, his frame compact, his step steady like someone who had spent his life among metal and machinery. To most people, he was a symbol of creative freedom, a man who built his own workshop, crafted rockets by hand, designed his own submarine, and spoke confidently of dreams that existed beyond every boundary. Yet up close, that dream carried a different undertone, an almost invisible pulse of the need for total control within a world governed solely by his own rules. The young woman smiled back and stepped down the steel ladder. The sound of her shoes rang twice, then vanished as her body disappeared through the hatch. The last sliver of sunlight lingered on the rim of the opening before a hand reached up, pulled it shut, and locked it with a dry, metallic click. The entire world inside sealed itself off, leaving only the steady breathing of the sea outside. Kim Wall was no stranger to confined spaces. She had once squeezed into the back of a pickup truck, rumbling along a dirt road, sat shoulder to shoulder in a dim room, where refugees told their stories through hoarse voices, and the scent of cooking smoke, drifted across the water in a frail wooden boat to interview a remote island chieftain, turned on her recorder in the sweltering kitchen of Havana, taken notes under the slanting rain in Colombo, while her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. Born in southern Sweden to a quiet, book-loving family, Kim grew up collecting maps and stories that crossed borders. She studied social sciences across Europe, trained rigorously in journalism and international policy at places like the LSE and Columbia, and built for herself a toolkit that was both precise and deeply humane, designed to take her into places others hesitated to enter. From Africa to the Caribbean, from the Middle East to East Asia, her stories appeared in major international outlets, all sharing one quality: a ground-level gaze, patient, fair, and always centered on the human being, not the storyteller. As a freelance journalist, she lived between Copenhagen and Malmö, carrying a compact backpack, a soft-spined notebook, a small camera, and a quiet gift for listening that made others lower their guard. She was preparing to leave Copenhagen for good, yet chose to stay one more night because this interview was different. Her subject didn't just have a story to tell. He possessed a machine, a homemade submarine that could take someone directly into the world he had built for himself. In that world, every entrance and exit was dictated by the host's hand, while the guest could only observe, ask questions, stay calm, and trust the skills she had honed over a decade, finding truth in confined spaces. The reason a journalist steps into such gray zones is not always adventure. It's instinct, mixed with a simple faith that every person deserves to be heard. Kim knew how to draw lines. She sent her itinerary to a friend, texted the expected return time, kept her communication channels open, but the submarine had no mobile signal, no external cameras, none of the comforting background noise of ordinary life. It was a sealed chamber like the inside of a chest, where sound was wrapped in steel, and each pulse of the engine was a heartbeat controlled by one person alone. Peter Madsen was accustomed to that kind of silence. He had often brought visitors aboard, treating the vessel like a stage where every cable, valve, and switch played its part in a private performance. His tours never changed the same words, the same gestures, the same reassuring rhythm. Each explanation landed exactly where his hand pointed, giving the illusion of safety, of mastery. But to someone like Kim, whose eyes were trained to look beyond the surface, beneath that confidence lay a mind wired with precision and dominance, a structure that allowed no deviation. She took notes, asked follow-up questions, studied the old scratches on the paint, the handles worn smooth by use, and caught the mingled scent of metal, oil paper, and insulation, a smell that promised and threatened in equal measure. The clock passed 7 p.m. The city above performed its nightly ritual. More lights turned on, curtains drawn, shop doors closed. Beneath the surface, the Nautilus began to drift away from the pier like a large, indifferent fish, straightening its back as the hull lifted clear of its supports. The water rippled. The deck absorbed a deeper shade of darkness. Somewhere on shore, her boyfriend stepped back to frame a shot and pressed the shutter. A small woman waving against a wall of black steel, a street lamp behind her fading to gray. Neither of them knew it would be the last picture. There are evenings when everything unfolds so seamlessly that it feels safe by design. The submarine glided forward, the water behind it sealed shut like a zipper. No wind, no alarm, only the familiar rhythm of machinery, the gurgle of water pumps, the low hum of the motor, the sigh of a valve. Kim sat on a narrow seat, strapped in, notebook resting on her lap, her eyes darting between the control panel and the small portholes that framed the outside world. She asked questions, and the man answered, just as in any interview. On the surface, it was routine. But beneath, layers of control began to stack. He turned off a navigation unit, dimmed a light, pulled a lever that silenced certain signals. Each motion was wrapped in smooth, almost tender explanations, so convincing that the person beside him might not realize until too late that something small, vital, had slipped beyond her reach. On shore, the routines of safety went on as usual. Friends exchanged a few messages, laughed at the photo taken before the submarine left, made plans for the weekend. As night deepened, the screen of one phone lit up, then went dark again, the usual message: home safe. that always followed every meeting, never came. A misplaced ellipsis, yet even then, intuition had no reason to sound the alarm. By morning, the news broke like a tidal wave. The submarine had sunk off the coast. The man had been rescued. The woman was missing. Those who had been at the harbor said he stood steady as he stepped off the lifeboat, his face showing nothing but a calm fatigue. He told them he had dropped her off the previous evening, perhaps she'd gone somewhere else. The words drifted away like a piece of wood carried by the tide. But what was recovered from the wreck weighed far more heavily. A drain valve opened from the inside, several electronic components dismantled, and in the cabin, dark stains blurred by seawater. The technicians noted, compared, diagrammed. They didn't say much. The metal spoke for them. You might remember now the sound of that latch closing the night before. It wasn't just a sound, it was a decision. And here, on this silent stretch of water, decisions, disguised as mechanical actions, began to take shape with a chilling precision. The story of an accident suddenly had too many fractures to align. Why were certain systems turned off? Why was the valve opened in a way only someone inside could do? Why was there no trace of navigation data from the crucial moment? Each why was like a drill bit piercing the steel hull, opening new holes for the truth to seep through. When the sea began returning what it had taken, the first thing to wash ashore was a fragment of a body, tangled in seaweed and fine sand, stripped of human wholeness. Morning walkers found it, called the authorities, and stood frozen, staring down as if unable to believe they were standing at the edge of a dark boundary between life and its negation. Days later, the head was found, sealed inside a heavy bag, clothes torn along the seams, and nearby another bag containing legs. Each was weighed down deliberately to sink, placed almost methodically along a path that only someone who understood currents and seabed topography could map. Nothing about it was impulsive. In the investigation room, a sea chart lay open, red pins forming a broken line that matched the vessel's course. Each point marked an unnatural stop, each bag a cold execution of a plan. Forensic results spoke in the sterile language of science. Clean cuts, consistent angles, traces of strangulation or asphyxiation before submersion. There was no longer room for stories about a falling hatch or a panic gone wrong. There was only calculation, a ritual, a man who turned his submarine into a locked chamber where he alone decided the rules of the game. From that point on, the story was no longer about an accident during a test run. It became an examination of every illusion we had ever held about those who crowned themselves pioneers. Onshore, the media changed its tone. Old tributes were quietly pulled from front pages. Inside a workshop, a hard drive revealed another world folders named after tools. Video clips depicting the mutilation of women as if it were an experiment. And on that deck, if you had stood long enough the night before, you would have understood it wasn't the darkness that took her, but a man who controlled every switch, who sent her beneath the surface and tried to hide her there. The sea stretched out like a sheet of cold glass. When it reflected against the submarine's black steel, you could almost see your own image staring back. Someone standing on the shore, who had once believed in the beauty of invention, who had ignored that small metallic click the ocean tried to warn about. And as the harbor lights dimmed another shade, the story changed its voice. It was no longer about a visit to a submarine, but a descent into a windowless chamber where oil and steam coated the air and every call for help echoed back as the breath of metal. In the days that followed, the sea remained unnervingly still, but along the coast of Amager, where the headless torso had been found 2 days earlier, dozens of small police and volunteer boats moved in slow procession. Yellow tape crossed the sand, and above, helicopters circled endlessly, their searchlights slicing through the morning haze like unblinking eyes hunting for a lost soul. Over 7 weeks later, on October 6th, as dawn tilted across the water, a few divers surfaced, dripping with oil, silent, and signaling to the shore. A small dark object was hoisted from more than 10 meters deep, a thick plastic bag bound tightly with a metal pipe. The commanding officer said nothing. He slipped on gloves, cut the wire, and unzipped the seal. No one spoke when they looked inside. A woman's face, bloated by water yet still gentle, high forehead, dark strands of hair. Salt water dripped down from a severed neck. The sea had returned Kim Wall's final gaze. Many days later, on November 29th, 2 arms surfaced. When the news spread, the city seemed to solidify, frozen inside glass. Cold headlines repeated everywhere. Journalist found dismembered. In Copenhagen's detention center, Peter Madsen sat upright, hands folded loosely in front of him, as if waiting for someone to read out the results of an experiment he himself had conducted. When questioned, his voice was calm, smooth, unshaken. "She died in an accident. I only wanted to remove her from the submarine, so she wouldn't be in the way." The sentence slid out cleanly, leaving no ripple, but the investigators knew anything that smooth had been sharpened for a long time. Madsen switched stories the way others swapped out parts. On the first day, he said he dropped her off at Refshalewen. The next, when the torso surfaced, he claimed a hatch had fallen and killed her. On the third, when forensic evidence confirmed Kim had died before entering the water, he said he panicked and dismembered her. Each self-defense version was calibrated like an engineering problem. Every time new data appeared, he recalculated the variables to keep himself inside the gray zone. Yet, it was that very precision that exposed him completely. A man conditioned to control processes, even the process of lying. In his old workshop at Refshalewen, police combed for clues. Amid heaps of blueprints, insulation foam, and tangled electrical cables, they found a hard drive hidden behind a panel. Inside were hundreds of video files. The forensic technicians played only a few seconds before stopping. The footage was static, low-lit, shot from a fixed angle, women bound, tortured, dismembered piece by piece to the sound of a steady, almost meditative breath behind the camera. Each file bore a sterile name: knife test, torso 2, cut angle. Together they resembled a grim catalog of experiments on the limits of the human body. When the prosecutor presented the evidence in court, Madsen merely shrugged. "I was studying tissue response under pressure," he said, voice steady, devoid of shame. The calmness itself unsettled the room, as if composure had changed sides. Maritime engineers were brought in to assess the wreck. They explained that for the submarine to sink in the way it did, the internal valves had to be opened simultaneously with the release of air in 2 compartments, a maneuver requiring intent, not panic. Madsen had deliberately disabled the engines to erase evidence, to bury the vessel along with the story he'd built around it. Radar data showed the Nautilus moving in erratic zigzags, stopping multiple times at coordinates later matching where each body part was recovered. It wasn't the route of a man in distress, but of one following a sequence measured to the minute. In his 4th statement, Madsen said something that seemed casual at first. "I just wanted to see how she'd react in a confined space." An investigator wrote it down and stared at him for a long moment. They all understood that sentence was the core. The submarine wasn't a vehicle. It was an experiment, a sealed underwater chamber where he was God, and the woman across from him was the variable. No one knows exactly when Kim died. Police determined only a 14-minute window of silence in the transmission log, a period when the vessel went still, then vanished from tracking. Madsen had turned it off, as if pressing a switch to erase witnesses. What's certain is that after she stopped breathing, he remained inside for nearly 3 more hours, cutting, dividing, sealing the parts into bags, and releasing them one by one into the sea. A night executed with the precision of a technical procedure. Throughout the 2018 trial, Madsen wore crisp white shirts, collar stiff, buttons fastened to the top. He didn't blink when the crimes were recited. When the prosecutor described the incisions, he nodded faintly, as though confirming a measurement. Those who knew him said he viewed the world through the lens of an engineer, an error, an object, a result. There was no morality, only efficiency. When asked if he felt remorse, He replied, "No. I only regret that my creation was destroyed." In the courtroom, Kim's parents sat side by side, hands clasped tight. They didn't look at him, only forward, toward a small photograph of their daughter on the table. It had once been a work photo, Kim amid a crowd, recorder in hand, eyes focused, a slight smile forming. That image had become the one thing Madsen couldn't dismantle, the fragment of light she had carried into every dark place she dared to enter. Danish media called it the collapse of society's faith in genius. For years, he had been hailed as the symbol of independent creativity, the man who defied institutions, who built submarines with his own hands, who dreamed of conquering space. But what lay behind that image? An obsession with becoming God, with controlling life and death within a world of his own making. The trial ended in April. When the judge pronounced the life sentence, he merely raised an eyebrow, nodded once, and said nothing. No sign of protest, no hint of defeat. In that instant, everyone understood he would continue living, within walls, like someone long accustomed to enclosed spaces. After the case closed, his workshop at Refshaloen was dismantled. Sheets of metal, blueprints, and engine parts were stacked and hauled away. No one dared touch them bare-handed. On the gray cement wall, half of an old slogan he'd once painted remained, "Dreams don't float unless you build them." Only one word survived: float. It became both a metaphor for the sunken vessel and the only remnant of his so-called dream. But the sea doesn't let go as quickly as people do. Each windy season, residents along the Amager coast still find small shards of metal washed ashore, bolts, fragments etched with numbers, pieces of the Nautilus. Every time they pick one up, they think of the woman who was once there, and the question no one can answer: when the hatch closed, did she realize it? The answer lies in silence. Forensics never found sufficient evidence of drowning. The final report listed the cause of death as undetermined, yet conclusively ruled out the falling hatch story. No cry for help was ever heard because there was no one inside to hear it. He didn't need to cover her mouth. Sound couldn't pierce the steel. The chamber he built was sealed tightly enough to hide every noise and thus tight enough to consume a life. Criminal psychologists later reviewed his profile and concluded that Madsen displayed traits of delusions of omnipotence, a pathology common to those who believe themselves beyond moral constraint. They don't kill to conceal. They kill to assert dominion. Madsen didn't kill Kim out of hatred. He killed her because she entered his world, because she saw him, because she might have rewritten his image in a version he couldn't control. And to prevent that, he did the only thing his mind recognized as absolute control. He erased the witness and kept the right to tell the story. In 2020, 2 years after the verdict and in the middle of a global pandemic, the news broke. Peter Madsen had escaped from Herstedvester prison. He claimed to have a bomb, threatened guards, hijacked a vehicle. For a few hours, he was free. Then police cornered him on a suburban street. He lay face down on the asphalt, hands bound, head tilted upward, the same smile still fixed in place. Perhaps, in that moment, he believed he had regained control of the game. But this time, the world no longer believed in his game. Not long after, the documentary The Investigation was released. It never mentioned his name once. The film told the story through the eyes of detectives and Kim's family, denying the killer the spotlight he once commanded. In its final scene, the camera lowered toward the sea waves, rolling over rusted fragments of the submarine's hull recovered from the depths. No score, no narration, only the sound of water, the last sound Kim Wall ever heard. Her family established the Kim Wall Memorial Fund, dedicated to supporting young female journalists reporting in dangerous regions. They said they wanted the light Kim carried to reach further than the waters that took her. Since then, each year, another reporter has set out with a recorder, a notebook, and courage, continuing the work she left unfinished. Many of them say they've seen her reflection in their own. Small, calm, steadfast, and convinced that every story deserves to be told, even when it ends in darkness. But the story of Kim Wall is not just hers. It is a mirror of an age too eager to worship genius without ever questioning its morality, to praise men who break boundaries without asking what those boundaries were meant to protect. Peter Madsen was once called a man ahead of his time, but the path he opened led only downward, into the sea. After the case, journalism schools added a new rule to their safety curriculum. When the source controls the space, the reporter must bring a second witness. A bureaucratic line, perhaps, but one written in Kim's blood. It reminds us that every time we enter someone else's domain, especially that of those accustomed to admiration, we must always bring an exit. The Baltic Sea remains blue. From time to time, travelers walking along the coast come across a small brass plaque near the spot where the Nautilus once moored. It reads, "To those who seek the truth, may you surface again." Below it are wild flowers and ribbons inscribed with Kim Wall's name. There are no grand ceremonies, only a few strangers who pause, bow their heads, and let the wind carry their silence out to sea. And somewhere beneath that still water, the rusting remains of the submarine lie motionless. When sunlight pierces the surface, it can almost appear to move, as if breathing. But it isn't. It's only the illusion of water. The vessel died with the man who built it. The sea, however, does not forget. Sometimes, a case doesn't end in court. It ends in the conscience of a society, where people are forced to confront what they once praised or ignored. When the verdict against Peter Madsen was delivered, Denmark wasn't merely condemning a man. It was condemning a misplaced faith, the belief that talent grants someone the right to move beyond morality. For years, he had been called a dreamer among the real. Yet no one ever asked what his dream was built upon. They saw only the submarine, the speeches, the glowing photographs in the press. They didn't see the quiet rage of a man who viewed every challenge as an insult. Nor did they know that in those long, solitary nights inside his steel workshop, he had been rehearsing what it might feel like to be omnipotent. Before his arrest, Madsen once said in an interview, "Only those who dare to step outside their comfort zone can touch the future." Perhaps he believed it, but he forgot that sometimes what lies beyond the comfort zone isn't the future, it's the abyss. For centuries, society has built monuments to the lone creator, the rebel, the outsider, the misunderstood genius. We admire those who break rules, believing difference always equates to brilliance. Kim Wall stepped into the world of one such man, carrying with her nothing more than respect for her craft and genuine curiosity. She couldn't have known that the so-called creative space she entered was, in truth, the waiting room of something purer and darker than hate, a form of evil born from the conviction that one can do anything without consequence. The following winter, the remains of the UC3 Nautilus were dismantled. When the crane lifted the corroded hull from the water, the steel groaned and cracked like breaking bones. The air filled with the stinging smell of salt and rusted oil. A few older engineers stood by in silence. One said, "It was an engineering masterpiece." Another quietly replied, "And a coffin." The hull was left on the shore for months before being cut into pieces and melted down. The authorities wanted to erase it from the city's physical memory, yet passers-by still pointed to the spot and said, "That's where the submarine once lay." Not in remembrance, but as a warning. Across Nordic journalism schools, Kim Wall's story is now the first case taught in ethics and field safety. It's not told to instill fear, but to remind students that curiosity must have borders. When facing a source who controls the entire space, a journalist must keep at least one thread leading out a signal, a companion, a contingency plan. Yet no one in those classrooms hears the ending without falling silent. Because the cruel truth remains. There are places where no preparation is enough, when you face someone who has decided to play God. Madsen was transferred to a high-security facility, confined to a single cell under round-the-clock surveillance. Guards who worked the night shift later said he rarely slept. He would just sit, staring at the blank wall. Once, he told a prison psychologist, "I don't think I'm a monster. I just created what others were too afraid to." The line was entered into his file, a final piece of evidence of how creation and destruction had fused inside him. A man capable of building a world could also destroy it with his own hands, merely to prove that he could. In prison, he filled hundreds of pages with technical notes, none mentioning Kim Wall. Every sheet was crowded with formulas, propulsion estimates, ratios of air to water, rates of descent. He still wrote about a next-generation submarine. Among the numbers, there were scattered sentences, fragments of self-talk. Pressure doesn't kill people. People kill people. The words, faintly penciled, looked as if written for no one but himself. Outside, the world did not forget. Kim's boyfriend, the one who took her final photograph, left Copenhagen soon after. He couldn't bear to pass the pier where the lights still shimmered on the water each night. Her mother, Ingrid, continued to work in journalism, but every article she published ended with the same line. For Kim, her father planted a row of small trees by the porch, saying that when the wind passed through, he could almost hear his daughter's laughter. They didn't demand justice again. Justice had already been served. What they wanted was for no one else to pay the same price. In the years that followed, young reporters awarded the Kim Wall Memorial Scholarship began sending stories from across the world. One wrote from Nigeria about women exploited in the oil fields. Another, from Mexico, investigating the disappeared. In each thank you letter, there was almost always the same sentence. She opened the way. And so Kim's death ceased to be confined to tragedy. It became a statement about the profession itself, that truth must never be allowed to die quietly. When the documentary Into the Deep premiered, the audience remained silent through the entire screening. The most terrifying scenes weren't those of blood or evidence, but the archival footage of Madsen before the crime laughing, speaking of his dreams of conquering the ocean, eyes bright, voice clear, and full of purpose. In the final moments, the film cut to the salvage, the submarine's hull breaking the surface, black oil blooming around it, sunlight piercing the water and scattering across the rusted steel, in a shimmer that was both beautiful and unbearable. No one clapped. The theater was silent, heavy with the realization that the line between a dream and a crime is thinner than we ever dare to believe. Someone wrote in Politiken, "If not for Kim Wall, he would still be called a genius." That single sentence became the most bitter summary of the case. Because before the sea returned her body, no one doubted him. No warnings, no oversight, no moral boundaries were ever built around him. When a society places blind faith in those who dare to be different, it forgets that difference is not the same as goodness. One early autumn afternoon, sunlight slanted across the old harbor, wind brushing through rusted railings, carrying a faint metallic rattle. People said it sounded like the sea sighing. Maybe it was an illusion, or maybe it was a memory that refused to fade. On a nearby wall, someone had written in white paint, "She went to tell a story and became one." The words needed no name. Everyone who passed by understood. Kim Wall's death exposed not only the cruelty of one man, but also the blindness of a society that deified talent without conscience. People celebrated the rule breaker, never realizing that one day he would break the line separating human from object. They admired those who said, "I can create life," but never asked whether they respected it. Madsen wanted to be remembered as the man who reached the ocean's depths. And he was remembered, but not in the way he wanted. Because in the end, it was Kim Wall, not him, who made the world stop and look inward. If you stand at the harbor on a quiet evening, you can still sense that strange kind of silence. It isn't emptiness. It's the pause that follows when a story has been told, a space left for the listener to ask, what drives someone to seek the light, and what turns another into the one who burns it?